All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We are continuing our series on Success Leaves Clues. We're um, bringing as an example the different characteristics, attributes of people that have been highly successful in life. Obviously, to become, president of the United States. Nobody's perfect, but arguably they've got, severe, significant talents that they've, implemented in their rise to political levels such as the presidency. Today, we're going to talk specifically about Ronald Reagan, just the top three. Great communicator, immense courage, and able to handle adversity. So we're going to get into examples of how it is that people have implemented the things that we talk about in our coaching programs that are handling or have these attributes at an extremely high level, so that we're actually showing how these have been implemented in others' lives and hopefully to help to better yours. So with that, we'll bring on Dr. Roger Hall. Roger is a business psychologist, executive coach, public speaker, multi-time author. And my favorite is the neuro nerd side of him that helps us to execute on the things that he talks about, understands the biology of how we operate and how actually to execute on the things we talk about. And bring him on. How you doing today, Dr. Hall?
I'm well. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. I think we're three in our president's version of our Success Leaves Clues, but these are fun. I like this series.
I like history, so this is fun to talk about.
I'll get into the housekeeping side of things, but as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm hopeful that the audience, the viewers, take away, that these are the things that historians have documented about presidents, and they've handled all kinds of things in their life. And these are the tools, the skills that you teach, you coach. That there's really no reason why they can't be highly successful in their own right. Maybe not presidents of the United States, but certainly high functioning, successful people. So
Absolutely, yeah. There have only been 46 and very soon 47 presidents, so that would make 45 individuals who've been president, because there are two presidents now who have served non-consecutive terms. But there have only been 45 people who've ever done that. So chances are of the 330 million Americans, most of us are not going to ever be president. But
right.
we can have incredible influence and become great leaders in our own right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's talk about the 40th president here in just a minute, but let me do some real quick housekeeping. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Jared Lee. I'm the associate broker and team lead here at My Home Connection, also known as MHC Realty. Our sponsor for today is the perfect real estate business that we've been developing over the last couple of decades, now in large part with Dr. Hall, introducing business coaching, life coaching, mentoring, and training, not just for your real estate business, but for life, to make you a well-rounded, successful individual in all aspects of your life. And then, of course, the things that are required to, be successful in your real estate business, and some that are coming online now that we can certainly help you with. So feel free to reach out to us and let us know how we can help. But as back to our topic in regards to the 40th president, I found it interesting in contrast when we talk about adversity, because that was one of Teddy Roosevelt's, our prior podcast, attributes. But he had adversity at a different level. Ronald Reagan, from what I understand, he didn't come from any means really whatsoever. Actually, they struggled. They didn't even have running water when he was growing up. So right out of the gates, this guy's got adversity coming at him.
Well, for his era, that was not particularly uncommon. So if you think um, he was about 70 in 1980, so he grew up in the 1910s, 1920s, and so unless you were in a large urban area, running water was not that common. People had outhouses, people had chamber pots, people had a hand pump well that they would use to manage their water. So it wasn't uncommon. So if we compare sort of a middle class life then to a middle class life now, it looks like poverty. But if we compare a middle class life then to, rich or poor back then, he was probably middle class. Certainly not affluent. He worked. He was a lifeguard as a young teenager, and he lived in a small town, Dixon, Illinois.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess what I was thinking is Teddy Roosevelt did come from an affluent family, had all kinds of means and all that. He had health issues that he had to deal with and power through. Anyway, the
Right.
point is, you know, we, we're going to get into adversity, so maybe I should
Yeah, we
wait till.
will.
Anyway, just wanted to kind of preface
Yeah.
the conversation there. But yeah, let's chat about the communicator side of Ronald Reagan, right? He was known as the great communicator.
Yes. Yes. And I think people disparaged him because they said, he is an actor, so you can't believe anything he says. I think, um, you know, I was in a high school play. I wasn't a very good actor. If you want to be someone who is going to be at an elite level in acting, you have to be good at your craft, which means you have to know how you affect other people, how they will respond to you. And so he was a master at that. So actors spend time learning how to communicate most effectively to help change someone's emotional state. Um, and frankly, most decision making is based on changed emotions. A lot of us have this idea that we make rational decisions, but in reality, we very often follow our emotional first gut reaction, our first hunch, and then we start rationalizing, telling ourselves stuff in order to feel better about what we've decided emotionally. So I think what Reagan and every other actor is exceedingly good at is, how do I persuade others? How do I change their emotions? That's what actors have learned how to do. So he was very skilled in this. And if you look at his approach to the United States versus Jimmy Carter's approach, Jimmy Carter was an engineer, and Jimmy Carter thought like an engineer. I mean, he was a nuclear engineer. He was on a nuclear submarine in the Navy. And so the guy was no intellectual slouch, but he completely missed the emotional tone of the American people. And he would do these fireside chats, and he'd talk about, the malaise that was crossing the country, and, how we got to all pull together to get past the malaise that's affecting our country. Well, he was the malaise that was affecting our country. We had hostages kidnapped by the Iranians. So the Ayatollah took over from the Shah of Iran. They kidnapped the people in our embassy and kept them for 500 and something days. And Jimmy Carter couldn't get them out. Couldn't do anything to get them out. And he did a lot of ineffective actions. And so what he was so focused on was, okay, we've got to do rational decisions. And he'd have like a pro and con sheet that he'd write out the pros and the cons. And what Reagan understood that human beings need hope. And he was able to communicate hope. And he was also able, and we'll talk about this when we talk about courage, he was also able to communicate strength. Carter did not communicate strength. And as a result, people lost confidence in him, and he got routed by Reagan. And so, and Reagan was our first president who had been divorced, and so that was like a big scandal. And now it's kind of like flavor
They all
of
get
the month.
divorced.
No, they're not all divorced. I mean, Obama's not been divorced. I'm going back, but yeah, and neither the Bushes had been divorced. Neither was Clinton. But more recently, yes, Biden and Trump, yes, both had been divorced. Actually, Biden was widowed. Is that right? Yes, he was
I think so.
widowed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Anyway, so it was very controversial. You have this really religious guy in Carter and this maybe not so religious guy in Reagan, but people understood that he was able to communicate hope, and they really got behind that. And he painted a picture of the United States that was far more strong, far more hopeful than people had experienced in a long time. And we had come out of the Vietnam War. We essentially got our we left Vietnam because it was a badly managed war, and our soldiers got their butts kicked. Not because they weren't courageous, not because they weren't good soldiers, but because the leadership mismanaged the war. So I mean, the whole country is feeling awful about itself. And so, for the first time since probably the mid 1960s, the country felt great. And so, from 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, when RFK was assassinated, the country was in this deep malaise, and Reagan said, "Okay, enough of that."
Right.
So it had been about a dozen years that the country felt pretty awful about itself. So he was able to change that because he was such a great communicator. And he very often went against the conventional wisdom. He did things at the time that were completely, off the rails. People said, no, no, don't say that. And probably the most famous was when he was running for the second term against Walter Mondale. The big issue was his age, because at the time he was the oldest president. And and everybody said, avoid it, avoid it, avoid it, don't touch it. And Reagan had other ideas. And so the interviewer, the debate host, brought up the subject of age, and Reagan said, I will not let I will not let age be an issue in this election. I will not let the youth and inexperience of my opponent be held against him. And the whole place just busted out laughing. And Mondale,
he laughed the hardest.
Laughing. And boom, end of discussion, game over.
Yep.
We're done.
When your opponent is smiling, laughing at your joke, you got it.
And it was not only an electoral landslide, it was a popular mandate landslide, in that Mondale only carried one state, his home state of Minnesota. Reagan got every other state because he was able to capture the hearts. And once you capture the hearts, you capture the minds of people. And so very often we tend to make the mistake of thinking that human beings are rational and we need to give them facts and figures. No, people, unfortunately, from my vantage point, they're not rational. And I hate to admit it, I'm not rational. I like to think I'm rational, but we're all following our emotion and then coming up with the reasons later. And great communicators know how to weave a story, to interact with people in such a way that they feel loved, they feel cared about, and that somebody's providing a vision of hope for the future.
Well, I appreciate you setting the stage of what he was able to do in the heart and in creating hope in our country. I hope our audience knows, like, obviously, Reagan had the benefit of being an actor. He could stand up in front of people and, he could act. Obviously most of us don't have that luxury, but there's no reason why we couldn't be great communicators if we have the right approach to things. And it's not that kind of checklist scenario that you're talking about where it's just kind of boring. It's super logical, not much emotional. But we could always be better communicators. One, maybe take some classes, learn some things to be articulate in your speech and present well, speak well. But it's more in what it is that you want to convey, how you want people to feel, rather than what you want them to hear. And as best I could tell, Reagan just did a really great job of feeling that excitement, that enthusiasm, that optimism, that hope, and to shift, do you call it a malaise?
Yeah, what Jimmy Carter called it. Yeah, it was malaise.
Yeah, I mean, to shift after a dozen years, that's not a trivial task,
No, it wasn't. And if you know anything about that era, interest rates were at double digits.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, as we're recording, interest rates are somewhere about, what is it? You know better than me.
Yeah, we're in the sevens.
We're in the sevens. Well, then it was like in the 18s.
That's crazy.
To, and so people just couldn't buy houses. Well, it took about 4 or 5 years for Reagan to change how things were going in terms of our economic engines of the United States in order to get interest rates down. But it was so bad at the time that people just couldn't afford to buy houses because they couldn't afford the loans. They they invented a term called stagflation, which is the economy was stagnant and prices were going up. Woo!
Yeehaw, best of both worlds.
Right. And so it really was a pretty awful time for people. So let me make one more statement. Lest listeners think that I'm an apologist for Reagan, when he was elected, I was, excuse me, I was too young to vote. But when he won, I thought the country was in dire straits. I thought he was going to ruin it. And then when he ran again, I voted against him. And so my opinion about Reagan has changed long since. But at the time, I was very critical of him. But my opinion of him has changed. Not that he's some heroic figure, because I think he had lots and lots of warts in terms of policy, in terms of consistency. But he was powerful and able to do something that no one had done for the previous 20 years.
Yeah. No, I think we could talk, ad nauseum about his communications skills, but really, I just want to encourage the audience to be better communicators and to. I think you said it earlier. I wish I could almost repeat verbatim what you said, but it's basically, read the audience, read the room, and see what people need to hear. And I think this is in line with the resident leader approach, where you can set aside your thoughts, your emotions, your annoyances, frustrations, whatever it is, understand what people, in Reagan's case, the country, and to some degree the world was feeling and sensing. And, this guy's got a lot of burden on his shoulders, and he just sure seemed, I've never seen a speech that he didn't give that I just felt like he was under control. Like clearly whatever he was going through set aside, including, and I'll go to adversity now because I think it's a great segue. So I'll skip ahead a little bit and then go back. But getting shot, this guy at the age that he was at, having been shot, go into the hospital and come out with the attitude, the optimism, the strength that he had, just from what I understand, was powerful to the country. And I was a little young, but I felt it and heard it.
Yeah, it was powerful. For those of you who are watching us who don't know the history, President Trump was shot on a campaign, hit in the ear. President Reagan, while he was in office, was shot in the chest, punctured his lung. He didn't know he had been shot until a few minutes afterwards, because the Secret Service, essentially body slammed him into the presidential limo, and he thought that one of the Secret Service guys had cracked his rib, and they start searching over, and then they find the bullet hole.
Wow.
And fortunately, they were close to the hospital. Fortunately, they were able to do the surgery, but it was touch and go. And there are these stories which may be apocryphal, but I think are true, that when they're rolling him in to the surgery center, they said, "Do you have any questions?" And he says, "I want to know, are you Republicans?" And the answer was, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." And so here's a guy who's cracking jokes as he's about to go into surgery for a life-threatening bullet wound. So, that's a special kind of guy.
Yeah.
To be able to bounce back from that adversity. I think if we look at other adversities in his life, he really took a lot of criticism when and what people may not know is he used to be a Democrat, and he changed he changed political parties, and that really hurt him in Hollywood. And he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he worked very hard to organize the actors to help them have better working conditions. And so he experienced lots and lots of criticism. So here's a guy not unfamiliar with public criticism, public disdain. And when you leave one political party and go to the other, after you've been established as a famous person, that's really hard and people will reject you. So he was familiar with people being on his side and then suddenly not being on his side because he had changed political affiliations, which is, by the way, not unlike Winston Churchill, who did the same thing. So it's not uncommon to see great leaders at some points in their life realize that their personal convictions no longer align with the party that they've been a part of. I think most recently we see this with RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, who two prominent Democrats who have decided, boy, this where our party is right now doesn't reflect us, so we're going to transition to another party. It's not uncommon, but that will get you rejected by everybody. Yep. And Reagan experienced that.
Yeah, I think it's important in leaders of that caliber to not be adverse to adversity. Like I'm gonna hit adversity, and what I put on on the slide here is it's not when or if, but when. And then what are you going to do about it? So just plan on it and know going into it, am I sticking with my convictions? Am I going to have a tough skin, and how am I going to power through it? Whatever your political views are these days, the one that strikes me the most is RFK Jr. Clearly, I don't know all the ins and outs of that process of changing political parties, but clearly here's a guy that was going to lose probably almost everything in his life, right? Wife's questioning why he's doing it. The people that he works with, this guy's royalty on the Democrat Party, so everything has got to go pretty much.
Well, he's lost. I mean, the hard thing is that his entire family are the royalty for the Democratic Party, and he's lost his whole family. He said it's going to be a tough Thanksgiving because I'm not welcome home. Wow, that's
powerful.
That's tough to think that your family doesn't want you anymore.
Yeah, and we obviously don't know what the ramifications of that decision will be long term. Now we're seeing the fallout of the dust is trying to settle, like you said, what's happening at Thanksgiving. But really, what'll happen to him the years going forward? Reagan clearly made the transition and was successful in doing it. You've talked about other presidents or politicians that have. Him and Tulsi, I don't know what'll happen. But I commend them for their convictions, because I'll commend anybody that could stand up to adversity and say, I'm convicted to do this in spite of the drama going on around me and how it affects me.
Can I circle it in a little closer to home for Reagan? Reagan, his eldest son, Michael, was adopted. His other two sons, Patty Davis and Ron Reagan, his son, of the three of them, the one that has had the closest relationship is his eldest, Michael. But, it was a heartache, I think, for him, especially Patty. Ron kind of took more of a middle path. He was actually a Democrat, but Patty was a vocal Democrat and didn't see eye to eye with her father for many, many years, and kind of was a thorn in his side, asserting her independence, trying to be different than her father, and really rejecting a lot about him. And there's a poignant memoir she wrote about his later years when he was taken over by Alzheimer's disease, and it's called The Long Goodbye. And in it, she reflects on what a good man she was and how much heartache she created for him in those times. And he always responded with kindness, generosity. And so it tells you, even though those closest to you are rejecting to you, he was always open to her.
Yeah.
And that really is that's a really beautiful thing, and that says a lot about him and how he handled that adversity inside his own family.
Yeah, well, I think maybe this is a good segue into the next one is courage, mental and moral strength in the occasion of whether it's painful relationships or, as I have identified here, danger, fear, difficulty, like whatever it is.
Yeah,
Are you going to be courageous or not? That's a decision we have to
yeah.
make as leaders.
I think one of the things that distinguished Reagan was he was really willing to take a courageous stance against the Soviet Union. For my lifetime up till his point, we were at this parity with the Soviet Union with our nuclear missiles, and we had enough bombs to blow up the world 50 or 60 times over. And everybody was saying, "Oh, well, in my town we're 7th on the list, or we're 11th on the list."
What a weird thing to calculate.
Well, but I mean, it was kind of the thinking of the era, that how long would we have to wait until we got obliterated? And so there was this real palpable fear of annihilation that this generation probably doesn't have. There's a different kind of anxiety that happens now, but in that era, it really was a palpable belief that we could all be dead here. We could all blow each other up and no longer exist. And so the thought of what Reagan did, of saying, it's the evil empire.
Wow.
It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
People were terrified by that. As a 17-year-old, 18-year-old at the time, I was terrified by that. I thought, this guy's going to get us all killed. But he, clearly knew more than I did, and understood that system of government was so bad for people that he wanted that system of government to fail. And he spent the first few years getting our economy, by creating hope, getting it running again. And we essentially outgrew and outspent the Soviets, and they were bankrupt. And so by 1989, the Soviet Union fell.
Yeah, and if I'm understanding history correctly, nobody was willing to call out Russia because they were all being PC and polite and all that. And Reagan said, enough of that, because that's not getting us anywhere. They're just growing in power. And to your point, we don't agree with communism. And then, okay, now how am I going to approach this adversary and win an arms race? And he did just that. And my understanding is, in part, some bluffing going on, and he, like you said, he kind of spent them into oblivion with their investment in their arms, and they just couldn't afford it anymore. But I'm just saying, like, what a courageous mind do you have to do that, all of that?
Yeah, it was a gutsy move, and fortunately for us, Mikhail Gorbachev, the head of the Soviet Union at the time, was a very bright man, and very and knew what needed to happen. And so when Reagan went to the Berlin Wall and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, everybody was terrified that
what did he just do?
Gorbachev was going to put his finger on the button. Gorbachev was too smart for that. He wasn't going to do that, and Gorbachev knew what he was dealing with, and this is not widely known, but it has been publicly written about in Edmund Morris's biography of Reagan called Dutch, that Reagan was starting to show at the end of his second term some of the early signs of dementia that eventually took his life through Alzheimer's dementia, and he was unable to manage his note cards. And President Gorbachev, when all of the aides had left, Reagan dropped all of his note cards and was kind of lost. And Gorbachev, to his credit, helped Reagan pick up his note cards, put them back in order to continue meeting. It was one of those times when we look back at history and think, okay, what was happening toward the end of his term was he probably was compromised, and that's maybe a topic for another day about presidents who are cognitively compromised. But we were very fortunate that he had the courage, and we had an opponent who was knowledgeable and wise and kept us out of trouble. But it was that push and that courageousness that eventually, 1991, the Berlin Wall came down, which, I visited, and I went to East Berlin when it was still East Berlin, and it was, it was a whole different world.
Yeah.
But that all changed. And all of that changed because Reagan was willing to have the courage to push against the conventional wisdom, what everybody thought would work and wouldn't work. It's interesting now. The Berlin Wall has been down longer than it was up.
Wild.
And in the world I grew up in, we thought it would last forever. Well, it didn't last forever.
Yeah.
And Germany's reunited, and we have different problems to solve.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I find it interesting, and this is me reading into it. I don't know if this has ever been talked about or is public or not, but I saw, so I've seen interactions between Reagan and Gorbachev, and I find it interesting. A couple things. One is the courageousness that Reagan exuded to him it seems like in a way that established massive respect. Even though they were adversaries, he clearly did it, and probably in large part due to being a good communicator, the respect from him, to the point where I watched the funeral, and Nancy and her reaction at the funeral, being around the casket by herself, and where she was at, and then Gorbachev going up. And I was like, wow, not only was he there, but the amount of reverence and respect that he had, all the way to the day of Reagan's death. I find that powerful. I don't know. It was interesting.
I think it is powerful, but it's a powerful reminder that Reagan also showed respect for Gorbachev. He disagreed with his adversary vehemently, but nonetheless, he respected him. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, that many of the people on our team would like us to disparage leaders of other countries. And it does take courage to show respect for people who are our opponents. They're not stupid. They may be our opponents. We may disagree with them, but that doesn't mean that we should disrespect them.
Yeah.
And I think Reagan showed that respect for pretty much everybody. And it was a time when he and Tip O'Neill would fight hammer and tongs all day long, and then at 5 o'clock, when the day was over, they would have a drink together.
Yeah.
And it was a different era where there was a great deal more mutual respect for people with opposing positions. And in this day and age, that is a courageous position.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for me, if you're not courageous enough in a position to confront somebody, I think it would be easy, and we're talking about presidents here, to say, I'm going to avoid them. They're not worth leaning into, because you don't have enough courage to challenge them or create the dynamic that a Ronald Reagan did. Because again, clearly there was respect on both sides, and you had to say, this guy runs the second largest, economy country in the world,
and most powerful world at the time. And there was a debate: were they most powerful relative to us or not? It's still a debate, but yeah.
Yeah, but clearly he had to be courageous enough to just lean in and say, I'm going to overpower him. I'm going to, we won ultimately. So clearly his approach to not cowering, not avoiding was very courageous, with amazing outcomes. So I'm just encouraging our audience to be courageous in whatever you do, to either take adversity or fear or, concern or, difficulty and lean into it and rise above it, because your outcome is going to be very powerful.
Yeah, I will put one little addendum on that Reagan wasn't reckless. Right. There's a difference between courageousness and recklessness. Mm-hmm. And he was not reckless. It was a calculated risk. Yeah. Because he had good information, and he had surrounded himself with really great advisors who helped him make better and better decisions. And great leaders do that. They're able to be courageous because they have good information, and they're willing to go with it and not live in fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'll go back to my favorite quote on fear by it's Ambrose Redmoon, which is, courage is not the absence of fear, but the belief that there's something more important than fear. So courageous people act even when they are afraid. They act with good information, so they're not reckless, but they do things that will make them unpopular, could be potentially dangerous, but they're calculated risks for a longer term benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that definition or that summary of courageous. It's interesting as I was going looking for definitions, the essence was kind of similar, but the way that they were worded was quite different. But I think that succinct definition with the nuances to it is very profound.
Yeah, he was a good writer, so
Yeah.
he encapsulated it well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, good stuff. Well, we blew right through the 30 minutes, but we covered
Always.
a lot of ground. Granted, Reagan had other attributes, and maybe we could share that on a follow-on episode later. But we wanted to capture the essence of some of these, and we highly recommend that you just kind of analyze where you're at in your life as a leader, and see kind of where you're at with these, and we kind of challenge you a little bit on it. But with that, let's make sure that everybody knows how to get in touch with you and where your resources are, Dr. Hall.
Yeah.
Let me load this up here.
Yep.
There we go.
You can find at my website, which is drrogerhall.com, drrogerhall.com. And on it, you can find out about how to find out more about the things that I do, the books that I have. I have 3 books, one of which is Staying Happy, Being Productive, the other of which is DIY Brain. My leadership guidebook is called Expedition, and I have a new book coming out called DIY Leader Brain. I have a couple online courses. One is called Freak Out. If you struggle with anxiety or fear, this 4-part 10-hour series will help you overcome that fear. And then we're making live the video version of the Expedition, which will be available on my website as well.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, again, covered a lot of ground. Hoping that this was encouraging to you, just to give you examples of how people have implemented the things that Dr. Hall covers and how to implement that in your life, and help you level up as you proceed forward in your life. So with that, we'll thank Dr. Hall and wish everybody a blessed one.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.